Jasmine Crockett once stood on the brink of giving up, ready to disappear without a word. Tonight, under the studio lights, she sat across from Steve Harvey, the man whose forgotten words had once pulled her back from that edge. The audience was frozen in silence. When she read those words to him, it wasn't simple gratitude, it was her redemption and his awakening. What could she have said that left the entire room in tears and changed Steve Harvey forever? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera slowly panned across the quiet audience, their faces warm under the soft studio lights. A familiar theme played in the background, not too loud, not too flashy, just enough to signal that something real was about to happen. Then Steve Harvey walked onto the stage, dressed sharp in a navy suit, his smile gentle but steady. It wasn't the usual showman grin tonight. It carried something quieter, like respect. He looked into the crowd and spoke with calm conviction. "We've got a guest tonight that I want y'all to lean in for," he said. "She's small in size, but the truth she carries, it's bigger than this whole building." The audience smiled. Some clapped. Others just watched, sensing this was not a night for jokes. Steve didn't rush. He knew moments like this don't need volume, they need stillness. Then Jasmine Crockett appeared. She walked in with grace, not performance. Her smile lit up the room, but her eyes told a different story. They weren't looking for applause. They were carrying something she hadn't spoken aloud yet. She waved gently to the crowd, then to Steve, and took her seat with the kind of quiet strength you don't teach, you earn. Her posture was calm, but her spirit felt like it had weathered a storm. Steve reached out his hand to welcome her. "Good to see you, Congresswoman," he said, voice soft. Jasmine chuckled. "Good to still be here," she replied, half joking, half honest. The two exchanged a few light words, the kind that warm up a room, but underneath it, there was something else building. Not tension, more like gravity, a sense that something personal, maybe even painful, was waiting to be shared. They smiled, they laughed. The crowd responded. But somewhere between the rhythm of their words and the quiet in Jasmine's gaze, it became clear. This wasn't just an interview. This was a release. No one in that room knew it yet, but by the end of the night, they would remember this not as a talk show, but as a turning point. The room was still smiling, but the light in Jasmine's eyes had already started to dim, like a door slowly closing behind her own laughter. The kind of shift only the camera would catch, not the crowd. She sat straighter, not from confidence, but control. Steve, sensing the change, glanced at his card again, then ignored it. He didn't need it now. What was coming next wasn't scripted. He folded his hands, voice softening. "Let me ask you something personal," he said, eyes locked on hers. "What's the closest you've come to giving up?" His tone didn't demand drama, it invited truth. A pause filled the space, thick and unforgiving. Jasmine didn't flinch, but something in her face let go, as if the question had touched a bruise that never healed right. She didn't answer immediately. Her lips tightened, not in anger, but restraint. Her gaze dropped, not to avoid the moment, but to survive it. Seconds passed, but they didn't feel empty. They felt like she was scanning years of pain, sifting for the one moment that hurt the most. She took in a breath, long, deliberate, heavy like it had weight. Then came the quiet explosion. "I actually wrote a resignation letter," she said. 5 seconds of silence followed, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for applause, only reverence. Someone in the audience audibly exhaled. A stage light above flickered slightly, almost on cue. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, but the kind of steady that only comes when a person's been holding something in for far too long. Steve sat forward, his expression tightening with disbelief but not shock. It was recognition. "You... what?" he asked, not accusingly, but like someone trying to process that the strongest person in the room had once stood on the edge. Jasmine nodded with a small, slow motion that looked more like surrender than agreement. "I was going to walk away from Congress," she said, "not because I was tired, but because I felt like I was slowly dying and nobody noticed." The words didn't echo, they sank. Her voice was calm, but behind every word was a scream that had once gone unheard. In the crowd, eyes welled up, not from sadness alone, but guilt. Guilt for assuming strength always means safety. Steve swallowed hard, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Jasmine sat with the silence like she'd lived in it before, and maybe she had. That moment, unscripted, unrehearsed, felt heavier than any speech or headline she'd ever given. She hadn't raised her voice, but the weight of her truth made the studio feel like it was leaning in. There was no dramatic music, no cutting camera angles, no flashing graphics, just a woman sitting under too many lights, finally saying the thing she never meant to say out loud. And yet, it needed to be said, because somewhere, in that breath between her confession and the world's reaction, people finally understood. The strongest voices are often the ones no one hears when they're breaking. Her confession had cracked something open, not just in the room, but in herself, and for the first time she didn't rush to cover it. She let it bleed. There were nights, she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper now, when I'd come home and forget how to be a person. She didn't blink. She didn't tremble. But her tone, low, almost matter-of-fact, hit harder than any scream could have. I'd spend the whole day being a punching bag on TV, in the chamber, even from people I was fighting for. The words dropped like iron. No bitterness, no blame. Just a truth worn down by repetition. She stared ahead, eyes unfocused, like she was no longer in that studio, but back inside one of those nights. And then I'd walk into my house, and it was just walls. Her voice didn't rise, but somehow it grew heavier. Walls that didn't ask questions. Walls that didn't care whether I made it home or not. Each word landed with brutal simplicity. She wasn't describing a moment, she was reliving a pattern that had swallowed her life. I'd sit on the kitchen floor, she continued. No lights, no food, just surrounded by stacks of files that didn't mean anything anymore. Her hands rested on her lap, motionless, as if still remembering the posture of those nights. They were bills, reports, speeches, but to me they just felt like weight. She said it plainly, but the weight of that sentence seemed to press against the entire room. Even Steve didn't shift in his chair. He just watched, still and wide-eyed, like a student in the presence of a story he never expected to hear. I wouldn't speak for hours, she said, not even to myself. Her jaw clenched slightly, not out of defiance, but to steady herself. Sometimes I just stare at a paperclip for 30 minutes, not crying, not thinking, just watching it, as if tracking a paperclip could remind me that time still moved. The image was haunting in its simplicity, a congresswoman reduced to silence, measuring her existence by the motionlessness of an office supply. There was no background music, no applause cue, just that slow, suffocating stillness that wrapped itself around the studio. She looked down, her voice soft but surgically precise. It was quiet, she said, but not peaceful, just quiet enough to hear myself fall apart. The line sliced through the room like a hidden blade, every syllable calculated, delivered with restraint, but underneath, a flood that had long gone unspoken. Then she looked up again. No tears, no plea, just the cold, aching clarity of someone who had lived through the silence too long to decorate it. And the worst part? She asked, almost rhetorically. I started to believe that no one would even notice if I stopped showing up. The moment was neither explosive nor theatrical. It was worse, it was real. In that silence, the weight of invisibility became undeniable. Jasmine hadn't just lost joy, or sleep, or peace. She had lost the sense that her presence mattered. And somehow, she was still standing, still fighting, still sitting there, telling the world what it chose to never see. What came next wasn't part of the script. It wasn't even meant for the room. But Jasmine said it anyway because some truths don't ask for permission to come out. She looked straight ahead, her voice softer now. Flashback, she said almost to herself. There was one night, I was walking, just walking. The air in the room shifted, as if everyone sensed this was the moment where the real fracture lived. It was raining, hard, that kind of rain that doesn't care who you are. Her tone didn't rise, but it hollowed out every syllable. I didn't have an umbrella. I didn't want one. She paused, eyes fixed on some invisible spot beyond the stage. I remember thinking, if I get sick, maybe that would slow the world down enough for me to breathe. Her hand stayed still in her lap, but her fingers twitched once. like muscle memory from that night. I kept walking. Streets were empty. My heels made no sound. It was just me and the rain. Her voice broke into rhythm, one line per step. Mouth closed, head down, no destination. Then her gaze darkened. My eyes were blurry, but I couldn't tell if it was the rain or my tears. She didn't need to explain it further. The audience understood. Her eyes flicked up just once before turning back inward again. It all blended together, she whispered. Grief, pressure, silence. You start to forget what part of you is wet because of the sky, and what part is broken because of everything else. The visual shifted. A dark car parked beside a lake, wind shaking the trees, headlights dim, like they too were tired. Scene cut to this, Jasmine said quietly. Me in the car, parked by the lake, wind howling outside. She narrated it like it wasn't her anymore, just a woman she had survived being. The room followed her into the car, into the stillness. It was late. I don't know what time. I just remember sitting there, staring at the screen. Her jaw tightened. The phone screen lit up, and the message was already typed. A beat passed, then her voice low and sharp. If I disappeared, would anyone even notice? The words didn't echo, they pierced. Steve's head lowered, his eyes burning. No one in the room moved. Not even the lights dared flicker. Jasmine folded her hands. Her tone sharpened not from anger, but from holding everything in. I held the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the send button. I was going to press it. Her voice paused, but my hand started shaking. A breath. I couldn't press it. I just couldn't. She didn't act it out. She didn't need to. The weight of that moment did all the work. I let the phone slide into my lap, Jasmine said, her voice steady but low. That message just sat there, glowing like it had come from somewhere deeper than my own thoughts. And I remember, my thumb was still shaking when it opened the YouTube app. I wasn't searching for anything, just trying to drown out the weight of what I hadn't said. I tapped on YouTube without thinking. My eyes weren't really seeing anything. I was just scrolling mindlessly through headlines, thumbnails, noise. None of it mattered. None of it even made sense anymore. And then, something stopped me cold. There was this video, just a black screen, and Steve's face not smiling, not performing, just still, serious, centered. It wasn't like anything I'd seen him do before. The title underneath said, "If you're breathing, God's not done with you yet." I just froze. I didn't even know why. My thumb hovered above the screen like I wasn't sure if pressing it would save me or destroy me. But I pressed play, and his voice came through, not loud, not overproduced, just calm, steady, and terrifyingly clear. If you're breathing, God's not done with you yet. I didn't breathe. I sat there staring at nothing, my body tense like that one sentence had crawled into my chest and wrapped itself around my lungs. I paused it. Immediately, just froze. Then I rewound it. Just a few seconds. Hit play again. If you're breathing, God's not done with you yet. And that's when I felt it, that crack, that tiny rupture inside. Like those words weren't encouragement. They were permission to finally admit how close I'd come to quitting. I didn't even move. Just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with one hand and clenching the other into a fist like I was bracing for impact. And then he said the thing that broke me. Success without peace of mind is a paycheck from hell. It hit so hard I physically jolted, like I'd been caught, exposed. That line, that wasn't a quote, it was a mirror. I looked at the phone like it had just punched me in the chest. My hands started shaking again. Not because I was scared, but because someone I'd never met had just spoken the most exact truth I'd never said out loud. And then I screamed, "Who wrote this?" I swear I shouted it so loud the window shook. "Why do you know me like this?" And then again, louder. "Why?" I hit the dashboard once, not to make noise, but because I didn't know how else to let it out. The sobs came hard, not the kind you can swallow or hide, the kind that drags your body forward until you're bent over the steering wheel, broken in half by your own silence. I wasn't crying because of what he said. I was crying because it felt like he had seen me. All of me. Without warning. Without filter. And for the first time in months, I wasn't numb. I wasn't quiet. I was undone and alive. And I remember thinking, maybe this was what surviving actually sounded like. The room was frozen, not by spectacle, not by performance, but by something heavier, the kind of silence that falls when someone says a sentence that never should have had to be said. Jasmine sat there, her shoulders relaxed, but her voice holding the weight of 1,000 nights. Her gaze didn't search the crowd. It didn't drift toward the cameras. She was speaking not to the world now, but to the version of herself that almost didn't make it. That night, I didn't send the message, she said. Her voice wasn't cracking anymore. It wasn't soft either. It was steady in the way pain sometimes becomes no longer fresh, but fully absorbed. I just played your clip again, and then I fell asleep. She let the words settle. No rush, no need to fill the space. It wasn't sleep out of peace. It was sleep out of emotional collapse, the kind that finally arrives when you fought everything and everyone, including yourself. And then she said the sentence that stopped Steve Harvey cold. You don't know this, but that sentence saved my life. She didn't say it with fanfare. She didn't try to make it land. It just did because the room understood what it meant. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't hyperbole. It wasn't inspired me or got me thinking differently. No, it saved her life. Steve's words, "If you're breathing, God's not done with you yet," had reached her at the precise moment when her entire body had given up on meaning. When her brain was saying, nobody would notice if I left. When her heart was screaming into a locked room that no one ever opened. That line didn't just speak to her. It interrupted her. It stood between her and the worst decision she was seconds away from making. Because when you're that far gone, what you need isn't motivation. You don't need fireworks or philosophy. You don't need promises of a better tomorrow. You need something small, something human, something stubbornly simple that dares to tell you that your breath, just your breath, is proof that you're not finished yet. And for Jasmine, that was the moment. Because breathing to her had become mechanical, meaningless. It was just the thing her body did while her mind and spirit disappeared. But that one sentence reframed it. It didn't ask her to fix anything. It didn't shame her for wanting to vanish. It didn't lecture. It just said, you're still here, and that means something. In a world that praised her for being strong, poised, relentless, Steve's words gave her permission to simply exist, to fall apart and still belong here, to not have the answers, to not smile, to not make a speech, just to be, just to breathe. And that was enough to stop her thumb from pressing send. The audience didn't move, not a sound. Even the studio lights seemed to dim themselves, as if they too understood that this moment belonged to no one but her. The camera slowly turned to Steve. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't blinking. His jaw was locked in place, his eyes beginning to water from a truth too heavy to process in real time. He bowed his head slightly, a quiet surrender to the gravity of what he had just heard. Both hands rested on his knees, fingers curled inward, like he was trying to hold something fragile and invisible. And then, one tear. It slipped down from the corner of his right eye and landed softly on the back of his hand. He didn't wipe it. He didn't even flinch. It stayed there, glistening, as if to remind him. Sometimes the things we say in passing land in places we never imagined. Because for him, that sentence may have been part of a speech, or a line buried in a clip he barely remembered filming. But for Jasmine, it was a defibrillator, a life raft, a crack of light through a sealed room. It was the first external proof that her presence still mattered, even if no one had said it to her directly. And now, they both knew. No applause, no music, just stillness. The kind that only follows the moment you realize something you said in the dark once kept someone else alive long enough to see daylight. And that's what this moment was. Not dramatic, not loud, but irreversible. Because Jasmine was still here. And she never would have been if that sentence hadn't found her first. Steve had just heard the words no one expects on a talk show. That sentence saved my life. But instead of retreating behind a joke or changing the subject, he did something else. He let the silence stay. And then, with a shift in posture and a tremor in his voice, he decided to go where the pain lived. "I lived in my car for 3 years," Steve said. The words didn't come with a setup. There was no dramatic pause, no stylistic emphasis. They just came out bare, bruised, and real. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't need to. The absence of sound said more than any reaction could. He wasn't trying to teach anything. He was just telling the truth. "People saw me smile," he continued, his voice low but steady. "But they had no idea. I once thought about ending it all just because I couldn't afford breakfast for my daughter." His eyes didn't move when he said it. They stayed fixed on the floor for a beat, like he was staring down a memory he still didn't know how to fully face. That sentence didn't just land. It hung there heavy, suspended, sacred. The words "ending it all" didn't feel distant. They didn't feel hypothetical. They felt lived. Across from him, Jasmine's breath caught in her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her tears hadn't fully dried, and now they began again, softer this time. Not from the sting of her own pain, but from the weight of realizing she wasn't the only one who had ever been that close to the edge. In front of her sat a man the world called funny. A man with millions of followers, best-selling books, and a face recognized across continents. And yet, once upon a time, he had sat in a car, wondering if life was still worth the fight, just because he couldn't give his little girl a hot meal. That realization didn't hit like pity. It hit like recognition. Steve didn't speak again right away. He glanced up at Jasmine, and the way she looked at him in that moment stripped everything else away. There were no roles left. No titles, no politics, no production crew. Just two souls, one who had nearly vanished in the dark, and one who had lived in the dark long enough to learn how to speak light into it. The stage lights above them suddenly felt too bright. Steve shifted in his seat, breathing deeper now, like he had just dropped 100 pounds from his chest. "That morning," he added, voice quieter, "I sat there, engine off, heat gone, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is how people disappear, not in explosions, in hunger." His voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, enough to remind everyone in the room that this was not a retelling. This was a reopening. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, hands folded, shoulders no longer square and strong, but rounded, softened. They weren't mirroring each other's posture. They were mirroring each other's damage. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. But somehow, what had begun as a TV interview had become a communion between two survivors, two people who had learned that sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is your own mind when it convinces you you're alone. Their eyes met and something happened. No flashbulb, no cue card, no applause. Just that stillness. The stillness that comes when one broken person says, "Me too," without speaking. It wasn't connection. It was collision of lived experiences, of sleepless nights, of days spent faking smiles and nights spent screaming into windshields, of wondering if anyone would notice if they vanished. And suddenly, this wasn't a story about strength. It was a story about survival. The audience didn't applaud. They didn't dare. For once, in a world obsessed with noise, stillness felt holy. And for the first time that night, they weren't a host and a guest, not a congresswoman and a comedian. They were just two people breathing. The silence between them had become something else, not emptiness, but reverence. Like grief and gratitude had decided to sit still together for a moment. Jasmine had said the sentence that shattered the room. Steve had answered with the memory that leveled it. But what came next was quieter, and somehow, even louder. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. The motion was subtle, but carried a strange gravity, as if her fingertips already knew they were holding something heavier than it looked. She didn't say anything at first, just pulled out a small, creased piece of paper, folded with the kind of care usually reserved for old photographs or love letters. Her thumb brushed the fold once, a hesitation, a breath. Then she unfolded it gently, revealing lines that had faded slightly, like they'd been touched 100 times but never forgotten. "This," she said, her voice even but heavy, "is a quote I've had taped to my mirror for the last 2 years." The audience didn't react, not because they weren't moved, but because they were holding their breath. Jasmine wasn't revealing a quote. She was revealing a lifeline, a quiet compass that had pointed her through nights when nothing else did. Her eyes didn't scan the crowd. They locked on Steve. Then she read it aloud, not softly, but like someone reading an oath. Silence doesn't mean you've lost. Sometimes it's how the soul survives. There it was. No music swelled, no applause cue. Just the raw impact of one sentence cutting through the air like a blade made of mercy. For a long beat, Steve didn't say anything. His eyes blinked slowly, not in confusion, but like someone being pulled out of a memory they forgot they ever buried. His face shifted not dramatically, but deeply. He looked stunned, not because of the words, but because of how far they'd traveled without him knowing. Then, through the tears still sitting stubbornly at the corners of his eyes, he let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from being humbled by your own forgotten strength. "Did I say that?" he asked. He wasn't joking. He was genuinely asking. His voice cracked halfway through, and for once, he didn't try to hold it together. It wasn't pride, it was awe. Because somewhere in the chaos of his own journey, the grind, the shows, the interviews, the survival, he had once spoken something that became someone else's anchor, and he had forgotten. Jasmine gave the smallest of nods. Her fingers slowly refolded the paper, edge by edge, crease by crease, not rushed, not showy. Her hands had clearly done this before. You could see it. The rhythm was muscle memory, the way you only fold something again and again when it has meaning too fragile to leave open. "And now I'm giving it back to you," she said, her voice soft, but the kind of soft that holds steel beneath it. "Because it looks like you forgot." She extended her hand toward him, palm open, holding the paper with quiet precision. The gesture wasn't grand. It wasn't theatrical. It was deliberate. It was final. Steve didn't move right away. He just looked at the paper like it had come from a version of himself he wasn't sure still existed. His hands, moments ago clenched from the weight of old memories. Slowly released fingers, unfurling, as if preparing to take back a piece of his own humanity. He reached out not quickly, not dramatically, and took it. He didn't open it. He didn't look at the quote again. He just held it, as if just touching it reminded him of something truer than his own resume, something deeper than applause, a sentence he may have only said once, maybe even offhand, between takes or during a quiet moment, now folded and carried by someone else like a sacred object. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't rush the moment. Her face was calm, but behind her eyes was a storm of everything she had endured to be standing here. 2 years. 2 years of waking up to that paper, of whispering those words back to herself while putting on mascara with swollen eyes, of repeating them like armor before walking into rooms designed to question her worth. It hadn't been a quote. It had been a shield, and now she was giving it back. Not because she didn't need it anymore, but because he did. Because sometimes even the people who teach us how to survive forget what survival sounds like in their own voice. The lights above them stayed low. The audience didn't move. The room held its breath as if any sound might collapse the moment before it was ready. Steve slowly placed the folded paper in the breast pocket of his jacket. It wasn't for show. He didn't press it down. He didn't pat it. He just let it rest there over his heart, as if trying to remember what it meant to say something so pure, and what it meant to hear it back after forgetting you ever said it. This wasn't a thank you. It was a full circle moment disguised as paper. And in that silence, that deep, dense, sacred silence, something happened that the cameras couldn't script. No titles, no lighting cues. Just one woman standing in front of the man whose words once kept her alive and reminding him that his voice still mattered, even when he'd stopped listening to it himself. Because the sentence wasn't just hers anymore. It never had been. It belonged to the broken, the breathless, the barely holding on. And now, for the first time in a long time, it belonged to him again, too. The moment lingered, heavy and wordless, after Jasmine returned Steve's quote, the same words that had kept her alive now handed back to the man who'd forgotten their power. But the silence that followed didn't die down. It grew, swelled, took on a weight of its own, like the room itself refused to go back to normal. People in the audience weren't blinking. Cameras stayed on Jasmine's trembling fingers, still holding the folded paper. On Steve's face, still flooded with disbelief. And then Steve moved, slowly, deliberately. Not like a man standing to make a point, but like someone walking toward a truth they'd spent years avoiding. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't look at the producer. His eyes were fixed on her, not Jasmine the congresswoman, not Jasmine the guest, but Jasmine, the woman who had broken herself open in front of millions, not to be seen, but to help someone else remember who they were before the camera started rolling. His chair scraped softly against the studio floor. Even that sound felt like it didn't belong too raw, too unedited. He rose to his feet with the kind of energy that made people lean forward without knowing why. A silence so absolute, you could hear someone across the room swallow. Then Steve spoke, voice quieter than before, but filled with something no script could fake. Everybody, I think we need to do this. No explanation, no lead-up, just that. And yet it landed like a lightning strike. Everyone knew what this meant. Without needing it spelled out, the energy shifted from performance to presence. He took one slow step forward, then another, until he stood beside her. Then he reached out, not dramatically, not with flair. He just held out his hand, and Jasmine took it. The moment their hands touched, the air changed. Not like a twist in a story, like something sacred. Like two lives that had been circling each other through pain and memory had finally met in the same place, not to fix each other, but to witness what survived. Steve bowed his head, and somehow that simple gesture brought everyone to their feet. No clapping, no music, no direction, just movement, quiet and solemn. One row stood, then another. The audience rose like a wave, not of excitement, but of reverence. From the interns in the back to the senior producers near the front, no one remained seated. It wasn't about politics anymore, or television. It was about recognizing something fragile and beautiful that didn't need to be explained to be understood. Even the sound crew stood, even the guards at the studio door. One man in the second row removed his hat and held it over his chest. A woman beside him quietly wiped her eyes, shoulders trembling. In that moment, applause would have felt cheap, so no one clapped. They just stood, staring, listening, feeling. And then Steve turned to her. His voice shook now, but not from nerves, from release, from something inside breaking open after being locked away too long. If I saved you with words, then today you saved me with your tears. The words fell into the room like a match into gasoline. Simple, unpoetic, but real in a way that bypassed the brain and went straight to the chest. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She didn't need to, because her tears, the ones still streaming down her face without shame, were her answer. They weren't weakness. They weren't breakdown. They were testimony, proof of what survived when the world tried to erase her. And Steve's were no different. A single tear slid down his cheek. He didn't wipe it. He let it fall. It hit his hand, the one still holding hers, and stayed there. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Steve Harvey wasn't the one holding the mic, wasn't the one cracking the joke, wasn't the one keeping the show moving. He was the one being seen. He was the one healing. The cameras, still rolling, had long since stopped being noticed. They could have cut to commercial. They didn't. Not one producer dared make the call. Because what was happening wasn't made for TV, it was made for humanity. For the rare, unrepeatable moment when two people from different storms recognize the same sky inside each other. Jasmine held up the folded piece of paper one last time. A few audience members leaned forward. She whispered almost inaudibly now, but the mic caught it. You don't know this, but that sentence saved my life. Steve closed his eyes. The quote echoed again, not from a screen, not from a cue card, but from her heart. Silence doesn't mean you've lost. Sometimes it's how a soul comes back to life. He remembered it now, where he'd said it, the guest, the context. But he never imagined it landed anywhere, that someone out there had actually carried it, not as content, but as oxygen. And now she was giving it back. And now I'm giving it back to you, she said, because it seems like you forgot. Steve chuckled, tears still falling. I said that? Jasmine nodded, her face steady, though her voice broke. You did, and it mattered. Another pause. A pause heavy with meaning. No rush to fill it. No pressure to entertain. Just space. Shared. Honored. Then Steve took a deep breath, his voice now low but firm, like someone taking the final step out of a long shadow. I've hosted over 1,000 shows, but this is the only one I'll remember when the lights are gone. He looked at her. Really looked. Not because it was dramatic, not because it went viral, but because it brought me back to something I thought I'd lost. Jasmine looked up. What's that? He didn't hesitate. Myself. A few in the audience couldn't hold their tears anymore. A man in the corner wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. A woman near the center leaned into her friend and whispered, This is what truth looks like. And it was. Not rehearsed, not stylized, just raw, human. The studio lights, still on their dim cycle, began to fade ever so slightly. No cue from the booth. It was almost instinct, as if the building itself understood that no spotlight could compete with what had just happened. No outro music played, no thanks for watching, no promotional rap, just breath, just stillness, and the unmistakable sense that something eternal had happened in a space designed to be temporary. The screen faded, not to black, but to something quieter, a soft dissolve. No applause. Just hearts beating differently than they had before. The applause never came, but the silence carried more weight than 1,000 standing ovations. As the last camera light dimmed and the credits rolled in hushed reverence, a quiet murmur swept through the crew, not out of protocol, but out of respect. Stage hands moved slower. Technicians held their breath a moment longer. No one dared break the spell that still lingered in the air, like incense after a prayer. Backstage, Jasmine and Steve were ushered down the narrow corridor leading to the green room. Neither said a word. Their footsteps echoed soft, deliberate, and somehow in sync, as if their hearts were still beating in the same tempo. Steve's hand was still loosely clasped around Jasmine's, not out of performance, but as if letting go would tear the thread that had just stitched two broken souls together. As they stepped into the green room, the noise of the world returned, muffled phones buzzing, distant chatter from the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights. But inside that small room, time seemed to stall. The air was thick with everything that hadn't been said yet. Jasmine sat first, slow and controlled, as if her body hadn't caught up to the storm her soul had just weathered. Steve remained standing, one hand resting on the back of a chair, his knuckles white. For a full 30 seconds, the silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt sacred. Then Jasmine spoke. Her voice was low, but it sliced the quiet like a blade through fog. I didn't come here to cry, Steve. He turned to her, eyes still red but focused. Yeah, well, I didn't plan to get saved tonight either. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, looking not at her but at the floor between them, like the space held everything they'd both buried. Then he leaned back, rubbed his face, and let out a bitter, broken chuckle. You ever notice, he said, how you can make a room full of people laugh their guts out and still feel like no one's actually heard you? Jasmine nodded, slow and heavy. It's like screaming in a soundproof box. Everyone sees your lips moving. No one hears the scream. Steve's eyes flicked to her, his face still. Then he whispered, That's exactly it. A long breath passed between them. And then Jasmine reached into her purse, not for her phone, not for her notes, but for something she hadn't touched since the ride to the studio. A single sheet of paper, folded in half twice, corners worn and soft. She unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. Steve leaned in. On the paper was a list, small handwriting, not a speech, not a script. Just a list of reasons. Reasons to go. At the bottom, in slightly shakier pen, one line. If no one would miss me, maybe it's not really leaving. Maybe it's just letting go. Steve looked up sharply. Is this? Jasmine nodded. Last month, right before your video found me. Silence again, but this one had an edge to it now, sharper, rawer. Steve leaned forward, elbows on the table now, voice trembling but steady. Jasmine, do you know how many people you just gave oxygen to tonight? You didn't speak to a camera. You spoke to everyone who's ever sat in their car and asked themselves if the pain was permanent? Jasmine swallowed. I only survived because someone else spoke first. Steve looked down at the paper again, then pushed it gently back toward her. Then maybe that's how we keep each other alive, one honest sentence at a time. The room grew still again, but not empty. It felt like something had settled between them, something old and nameless. Maybe it was grace. Maybe it was understanding. Or maybe it was just the kind of quiet that follows a soul that's been seen. Steve broke it with a whisper. I almost ended it in a Wendy's parking lot. Jasmine blinked. What? He looked at her. No humor in his eyes now. No mask. 3 years in my car, trying to look my daughter in the eye knowing I couldn't buy her breakfast. One day I just broke. Had a bottle of pills in the glove box. Turned on the engine, heater running, said my goodbyes. Then I heard her laugh on my voicemail. Left me a message telling me a joke she made up at school. A pause, and he choked. I broke in a different way. I threw the pills out the window, spent the night crying into my steering wheel. Next day, I went and did an open mic show like nothing happened. People laughed. They had no idea they were laughing with a ghost. Jasmine leaned forward, eyes brimming. Steve, no, he said, holding up a hand. You need to know, because when you said I couldn't press send, I felt it. Like, word for word, I've been there. He exhaled, long and shaky. Sometimes survival doesn't feel noble, he added. Sometimes it just feels like losing slower than you planned. Jasmine nodded. And sometimes the only thing keeping you alive is someone you'll never meet. They locked eyes again, this time not as strangers, not even as friends, but as witnesses of each other's scars, of each other's victories, of the spaces in between. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the green room door. A young assistant poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, she said, voice cautious, but someone's waiting outside for you, Jasmine. Says they don't want an autograph. Just a thank you. Jasmine stood, slow and composed. She glanced at Steve, who gave a small nod. Then she walked to the door and stepped out. The hallway was quiet except for a teenage girl standing by the wall, maybe 15, clutching a worn denim jacket to her chest. When Jasmine approached, the girl didn't speak. She just pulled up her sleeve and showed Jasmine her forearm. Written in black Sharpie, if you're breathing, God's not done with you yet. Jasmine froze. Her chest tightened. The girl didn't cry. She just smiled, a real one. A small, brave thing. I wrote it down last year, the girl said, voice soft. Tonight I learned who said it, and that you remembered it too. Jasmine stepped closer, reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. Keep breathing, she whispered. The girl nodded and walked away. When Jasmine returned to the green room, Steve was still seated. She sat beside him, not across from him this time. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence had changed. It no longer asked for explanation. It simply held them, right where they were. Whole, human, here. The next morning, the world was already different, even if it didn't know it yet. Across the country, people turned on their TVs, phones, laptops, expecting their usual wave of headlines, noise, and spectacle. But instead, they found something still, something raw, something that refused to perform. Clips from last night's show, unedited, unspun, had begun circulating like wildfire. Not the flashy kind that eats up scandals and controversy, but the slow-burning kind that finds its way into group chats, into classrooms, into hospital waiting rooms, into the silence of someone's living room at 3 a.m. A single phrase was quoted over and over again, scrawled across chalkboards and office windows in dry erase marker. If I saved you with words, then tonight, you saved me with tears. That was the line that stuck. That was the sentence people couldn't unhear. Something about it cracked open a space that had long been sealed. It wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a mirror, and people were looking into it. In a school in Milwaukee, a teacher paused mid-lecture, played the clip without warning, no lesson plan. Just silence, then Jasmine's voice trembling, defiant, human. One student left the room crying, not out of sadness, but relief. In a correctional facility in Arizona, an inmate sat with headphones, eyes closed, rewinding one part over and over. Silence doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes it's how the soul rebuilds itself. He wrote it down in pencil on the back of his disciplinary report. The guards didn't ask. In D.C., U.S. Senator's aide forwarded the video to their boss with a note. "Sir, you should see this. It's not politics, it's truth." The senator didn't reply, but the next day a bill proposal that had been quietly buried 3 months ago was mysteriously pulled back to the floor. And in Houston, in a dim kitchen with flickering lights, a woman watched the clip 3 times. Then she reached for the envelope she'd sealed 2 nights earlier, her suicide letter, and slid it into the trash without opening it. She didn't cry. She just made coffee and opened her curtains for the first time in weeks. The echo wasn't loud, it was seismic. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat alone on her front porch, legs tucked under her, staring at the sunrise with a kind of reverence she hadn't felt in years. The Texas air was heavy, but her chest wasn't. Not today. She hadn't turned on her phone yet. She didn't need to. The silence in her bones was speaking louder than any notification ever could. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Her sister Maya appeared in pajamas, holding a steaming mug. "People are already calling," Maya said softly. "News, podcasts. A professor from Yale wants to make your speech part of their ethics curriculum." Jasmine took the mug, nodded. "Let them call." Maya sat down beside her. "You good?" A long pause. Then Jasmine smiled, not wide but real. "I'm still here," she said. Maya placed a hand on hers. "That's enough." Elsewhere, Steve sat in his dressing room alone, surrounded by flowers and cards he hadn't read yet. His assistant had tried to schedule interviews, morning shows, book deals. He told them no. He looked in the mirror, the same mirror where, months ago, he had stared into the abyss and wondered if there was anything left to give. Now the same face looked back at him, but something behind the eyes had shifted. Not fixed, not healed, but open. He reached for a pen and wrote 3 words on a Post-it. "Say it anyway," then stuck it in the corner of the mirror. Not for the world, for himself. By the end of the week, the network had re-aired the episode 3 times. Not for ratings, though, those had skyrocketed, but because demand came not from sponsors, but viewers. Students wrote letters. Nurses called in during shifts. Soldiers stationed overseas asked for the clip to be sent to their units. One mother wrote, "My son hasn't spoken to me in months. Last night, he walked into the living room, sat beside me and watched in silence. When it ended, he said, 'I didn't know people on TV could feel things like us. Thank you.' Another email read simply, 'I pressed send. The note is gone. I'm still breathing.' The producers, many of whom had built careers on controversy and conflict, sat in their break room reading the messages. No one spoke. One cameraman, hardened by years of watching people perform pain, finally whispered, 'We aired something real, maybe for the first time.' Back in Texas, Jasmine visited her old high school. No camera crew, no press release, just her, a denim jacket, and a stack of handwritten letters for students who might need them. She slipped into the library where a group of teens had just finished watching the segment for their media literacy class. When she walked in, a few gasped. One girl covered her mouth. Jasmine smiled. "I'm not here as a celebrity. I'm here as someone who almost didn't make it either." She took a seat on the edge of the teacher's desk, looked around the room. "You don't have to clap. You don't even have to like me. I just want you to know whatever weight you're carrying, it's real. But so are you." A boy in the back raised his hand. "Did it work?" "What?" Jasmine asked. "Saving him," the boy said. "Did your tears really change anything?" She thought for a long second. Then, "No, my tears didn't change him. They reminded him he was still allowed to change himself." The room went still. 1 week later, Jasmine and Steve met again this time. No cameras, no crew, just 2 chairs under a tree outside a community center. Steve brought sandwiches. Jasmine brought quiet. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They had become something larger than guests on a show. They were now symbols not of perfection, but of permission. Permission to feel, to fall, to speak, to sit in the dark until the light finds its way back in. As they parted, Steve turned and asked, "Would you ever do it again?" Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Cry on national TV?" He chuckled. "No, I mean, tell the truth like that." She looked at him. "It wasn't the truth that scared me. It was realizing how many people needed it." Steve nodded. "And now they have it." Across the country, the echo continued. Not loud, not polished, but present. It lingered in classrooms, in hospitals, in halfway houses and living rooms. It lived in quiet conversations between fathers and sons, in text messages that said, "You free to talk?" And "I saw this and thought of you." It wasn't a viral trend, it was a reckoning, because people didn't just hear Jasmine or Steve, they heard themselves. And in a world built on noise, the echo of honesty was the loudest sound of all. But even as the echo continued to ripple across the country, deeper questions began to rise. Questions that couldn't be answered with applause or headlines. Because what happened between Jasmine and Steve wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And mirrors don't just reflect others, they reflect us. The audience had changed, but now the real question remained. Would they carry that change forward or leave it behind like another episode? That's where the lesson begins, not on a stage, not under studio lights, but in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. What Jasmine gave wasn't just truth, it was permission. Permission to feel without apology. Permission to speak without armor. Permission to admit we're tired, angry, or afraid. And for many people who've spent years swallowing their voice just to survive, that kind of permission can be more powerful than 1,000 speeches. Because truth isn't just what you say, it's what you allow others to feel in your presence. Steve had spent his whole career mastering the art of performance, making people laugh, cry, feel seen for an hour, then forget it all the next day. But Jasmine shattered that script. She didn't perform, she didn't sell, she stood. And when she did, she reminded us that real strength doesn't always sound like thunder. Sometimes it trembles, sometimes it weeps, but it always stands. So what does that mean for the rest of us? It means this: if you were born with a microphone, learn to listen before you use it. Because the truth doesn't come with an edit button. It means stop mistaking volume for value. Just because someone yells doesn't mean they're right. And just because someone cries doesn't mean they're weak. What Jasmine did in that studio wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. Not just for her, but for every person who's ever been told their emotions made them unprofessional, unfit, or unworthy. We live in a culture that rewards polish over pain, charisma over clarity, dominance over decency. And yet here was a woman who stood in the fire, not to destroy, but to feel. And that changed everything, because people don't need more role models who never bleed. They need witnesses who can say, "I bled too, and I'm still here." And Steve, he didn't just redeem himself with a quote. He sat in it. He sat in the discomfort, the shame, the silence. And in doing so, he gave men permission to do the one thing they've been told never to do: feel accountable without collapsing. To say, "I got it wrong," without demanding forgiveness. That's not weakness. That's moral courage. And we don't see nearly enough of it, because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't defend himself, it's listen. And sometimes the boldest thing a woman can do isn't fight louder, it's refuse to perform for the fight. That's what Jasmine did. That's what this story demands from all of us. So what now? You don't need a TV studio to speak truth. You don't need an audience to matter. You don't need to go viral to be real. The next time someone says something that crosses a line, you don't have to explode, just ask, "What made you think that was okay?" The silence that follows might be the most honest sound they've ever heard. The next time someone you love cries in front of you, don't tell them to calm down. Don't hand them a solution. Just say, "You're safe here." Because healing doesn't start with answers. It starts with safety. And when you're the one who's breaking when the tears come, or the anger rises, remember Jasmine. Remember that you are not dramatic. You are not unstable. You are not too much. You are alive. And alive things feel. Because the system doesn't break you by accident. It breaks you on purpose. It convinces you that your softness is your flaw, that your decency is weakness, that your ability to care deeply is an inconvenience to power. But Jasmine didn't apologize for caring. She weaponized it. And that made her dangerous in all the right ways. So the next time someone mocks your passion, asks you to shrink, or labels your truth as too intense, just smile and say what Jasmine could have said, but never needed to. If I can make you uncomfortable with the truth, imagine what I'll do when I start changing it. Because this world doesn't need more silence. It needs more echoes. And echoes don't begin with famous people. They begin with ordinary people who decide that today they're going to stop pretending. That today they're going to stop watching and start standing. They begin when a teacher lets a student cry in class and doesn't mark them late for it. They begin when a father says, "I'm sorry" first. They begin when a young girl hears someone like Jasmine speak and realizes she doesn't have to wait until she's older to be taken seriously. And they begin when you, wherever you are, choose not to laugh along, not to look away, not to say it's not my place, because it is your place. If you're in the room, if you're alive, if you have a heart, then it is your place. Justice isn't a title, it's a temperature. You either raise it or you let it drop. And if you stay quiet while it drops, don't be surprised when one day, no one can feel anything anymore. But if you raise it, if you dare to raise it, then people like Jasmine aren't alone. Then Steve's redemption wasn't wasted. Then this moment wasn't just television, it was transformation. So here's the real call to action. Don't just applaud, apply. Apply it to your dinner table. Apply it to your boardroom. Apply it to your silence. Apply it to your next choice, the one you've been avoiding. The one that scares you, the one that could change everything. Because if Jasmine Crockett taught us anything, it's that the truth isn't what gets you kicked out of the room. It's what builds a new room, one where people finally belong. Where the person crying isn't told to stop. Where the person learning isn't mocked for not knowing sooner. Where the person who once caused harm is still welcome, but only after they admit it and sit in it. This story didn't give us heroes. It gave us permission. Now the only question left is, what are you going to do with it? And if that permission meant anything, if her silence gave you a voice, even for just a second, then it doesn't end when the lights dim. It begins there. You don't walk away from a moment like that unchanged. You carry it. You wear it. You do something with it. Because otherwise, all it becomes is a powerful scene that you applauded, then forgot. So this isn't applause. This is ignition. You've seen what it looks like when someone stands in a fire and refuses to burn. You've seen what truth sounds like when it's delivered not to impress, but to survive. You've seen what happens when someone tells their pain, not for sympathy, but so no one else has to carry it alone. So what now? Don't tell the world you were inspired. Prove it right now. Because every system that tried to crush her, every room that expected her to fail is still out there. And it doesn't get dismantled by emotions. It gets dismantled by action. If you work in an office, speak up when the hiring practices always favor the same face. If you sit on a board, demand clarity on where the money actually goes. If you're a parent, teach your kids that silence in the face of injustice isn't politeness, it's permission. And if you have a platform, even a small one, use it like it matters. Because it does. Start calling things what they are. Stop dressing up bias and professionalism. Stop pretending discrimination is just the way things work. Stop excusing power because it's uncomfortable to challenge it. Because here's the truth. The systems that silence people like Jasmine don't survive because they're strong. They survive because too many people stay quiet. Because too many people say, that's not my fight. Because too many people fear being the first to stand. So be the first. Be the one in the meeting who says, I don't think that's right. Be the neighbor who says, that's not okay. Be the friend who doesn't laugh at the joke that punches down. Be the stranger who intervenes when someone's being cornered. You don't need a badge. You don't need permission. You are the permission. And if you've ever been the one who was talked over, underestimated, written off, then hear this. You don't owe anyone your silence anymore. You don't need to apologize for taking up space. You don't need to water down your words. You don't need to ask if your truth is too much. You are not too much. You are finally enough. You don't have to go viral to make a difference. You just have to go real. Because the next Jasmine isn't watching Congress. She's watching you. She's watching how you respond when the room gets uncomfortable. She's watching what you say when no one's filming. She's watching whether your courage survives the comment section. So give her something real to watch. Give her a blueprint. Show her that strength doesn't mean being loud, it means being clear. Show her that survival isn't just about making it through the fire, it's about dragging others out with you. And show her that change doesn't come with a permission slip, it comes with a decision. So make yours. Today, turn the phone off and walk into a real conversation. Don't repost the clip, rewrite the culture, challenge the policy, demand the receipts, protect the kid who doesn't speak English, defend the woman who's always interrupted. Speak the name no one wants to hear. Share the story that still haunts you. Don't shrink. Because Jasmine didn't shrink. She didn't play it safe. She didn't wait for approval. She didn't need the room to clap. She needed them to wake up. And so do you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.